So got a presentation, got some slides, just highlighting some of the things, trying to give you a sense of the breadth and depth of the Hawley Collection. Okay, Stephen? Right, so this is the man himself, Ken Wybert Hawley. You probably never met anybody else called Wybert, I don't think, before. And I don't think we use that often. Ken died in the period when I just registered to be a volunteer. So I never really had much of an association with Ken, but Ken essentially was a legend in the city. He ran a tool shop, and his family pedigree was that his dad owned a company that essentially made fire guards for machines. And he left school at 16 to go into the family business. Yeah. And well, I suppose Ken set about building a collection. Yes, Steve. Yeah. So this is what a famous person said about the collection. So they talked about it as an outstanding asset of national and international significance. I do like it when we can say anything about Sheffield and say it's the world best, or it's international, or it's world famous. And this guy was Neil Cousins. He said, I know of no other comparable collection relating to history, technology, and evolution of tools and cutlery and their manufacture. So that's quite a bold claim. The other thing is, Keith, our chair, who's standing at the back, he's sometimes Googled what's the biggest or best tool collection in the world, and actually we always come out in the top 10. Sometimes we come out at the top, and the other thing is, and I'll probably say it 2 or 3 times, the thing that's unique about the Hawley Collection is it's totally accessible. Okay, some of you walked through bits of it today. If you come and ring the doorbell, and ask to see a plane or a source, somebody will help you do that. And everything we've got is here. So we don't have lots of things stored off site. We don't have to say, oh, we'll get you in 6 months' time. And I think it's fair to say we're getting more and more inquiries. All right, so just a little bit of the journey so far. Right, so this is a picture of Ken, and he's holding a tool. Ken had no interest in collecting whatsoever, but he ran a tool shop. Okay, and it's quite famous. I once met somebody who tried to take something back to him, and it didn't end well for the person who tried to take something back. But Ken knew his stuff. And one day he went to demonstrate an electric plane at somebody that made coffins. Okay, and he saw this tool hanging on the wall or lying around, and he basically said, can I have it? Or you'll not be wanting that then. And Ken spent 30 plus years. He did it 2 ways. One is he went out there proactively and said, can I have it? And I always tend to think he had a big Volvo. I like to think he had a big coat as well, so he never left anywhere without things. But also, of course, he got a reputation for people then to give him things. And that reputation carries on. I say we're accessible. People turn up at that door with a box or a bag and they say, would you like this? And often it's like my dad's tools, or it's my granddad's tools, or it's my uncle's tools. And generally we'll say, yes, we'll have it if we haven't already got one. Yes, we'll have it if it's in better condition than the one we've actually got in the collection. And generally they say, and the other thing is, under no circumstances do I want it back. So we are carrying on Ken's collecting tradition. Yeah. All right. So it's just a story there, from 1955. The second picture is Ken's house. So all this collection was in Ken's house. And I think at some point there was probably a fairly serious discussion with his wife. He probably said at some point, right, Ken, either you go, the collection goes. I don't know. But anyway, amazing that, Ken didn't wait for somebody to give him a building. He started and he got on and did it. He then did scrounge a building from Sheffield University, which is called the Hawley Building. And it's still got the Hawley Building written on it. So it was great. Ken assembled a group of volunteers who worked in the industry. And he started cataloguing for things he'd already collected, but there was no public access. Moved that on to 2010, 2013. Essentially, we moved down here. There was a spell in between when we could have moved to the Millennium Gallery. I'm really pleased we didn't move to the Millennium Gallery, because we would have had the display space, but we wouldn't have had the storage space. So it would have been a bit more high profile, but we wouldn't have been able to carry on the work that we're actually doing. I'll just test again, see if it's any better. I think there's only one person now having trouble actually hearing it. So, okay. Yeah, if you want to move on. Yeah, so obviously we've moved into this location, which is fantastic. We'd love to take over the yard out there if we could, but with this being a listed building, that's a bit of a challenge. Yeah, yeah. So we have done quite well in terms of lottery funding. Um, I can't claim any credit for the early ones because I wasn't involved, but the last three I've been very involved. And I think there is a lesson here for some of these organisations. You need to build your credibility with the lottery. It's no good starting at the lottery and saying we want £250,000. But if you go to them and say we want £10,000 or £20,000 and you've got a good idea and you do a good job and you meet the criteria, then you can go back a couple of years later and say, all right, we might like to double that to £40,000. Some of these grants were actually won by the museum. And obviously there's a point where Kelham Island was a separate part of the industrial museums. But there's certainly the last three, we basically came up with good ideas. The Nail and a Knife Blade, the Sheffield Treasures, established our credibility and then went for a bigger bid. And the only reason why that's a lot bigger bid is because we employed somebody. For the first time since very early on in this process, we're employing somebody, James, for 3 days a week. And that does make a huge difference to a volunteer trust that has a different team of people in. If you came in tomorrow, it's a totally different team of people in. And with the best will in the world, sometimes things get lost between one day and another. We did get, there was some legacy money in Sheffield with the River Don Mill Owners Association. And at one point they paid for some of the physical refurbishing of this. Because again, something we're eternally grateful for is obviously we are hosted free by Sheffield Museums. We don't have to worry about a building. Okay, we'd love more space. But actually, it's great that we have that partnership with Sheffield Museum. We actually think we add a lot of value to them, but they also add a lot of value to us. Yeah. That's the stone garden. But this was an old soul works. So some parts of an old soul works. Some parts of this site were an old power station. So, again, it's a proper, authentic industrial building. Yeah. Yeah. So just keep running through, Steve. Yeah. Right. So what does the collection consist of? Essentially, it could almost be summed up with light edge tools. Okay. And light edge tools and things that cut, we're not talking about machines. Okay. The collection is not about machines. So we've got light edge tools, some heavy edge tools, joiners tools, woodworking tools, engineers tools, tapes, rules, land chains, precision measuring instruments. As I say to you, one of the things about Sheffield is we've always been into precision engineering. If you think in modern parlance, if we're going to drop something in the middle of the North Sea, it's got to be right. You can't say, oh, we're out by a centimetre, can we bring it back up and take it? So the whole notion about precision measurement, and again, that's something that Sheffield is still famous for. We can do things big time. Cutlery, hollowware, flatware, surgical instruments, which is something people don't think about as being one of those things made in Sheffield. Swan Morton up the road, still making 10 million surgical blades a week. Flatware, specialist tools for miscellaneous trades, and domestic items. So it's an interesting thing about how do you organise a collection. Yeah, that threw me. You might have got a pause then. So I don't know, something like a spade might count as a heavy edge tool. We've certainly got plantation tools that would have been breaking open the Wild West. And so adzes and things like that, I guess they might pass heavy edge tools. If you want a little back up his tour afterwards, there's a hammer that I'd almost defy you to pick up. It's so heavy, and certainly to ask anybody to lift it with the shoulders is virtually impossible. I don't know. So yeah. Next one, Stephen. So the other thing Ken was interested in is both how things were made and what they were made from. Okay, so as I said, sometimes it's a challenge with the museum. Do you organise things by age? Do you organise them by function? In the case of Sheffield, do you organise them by company? Okay, so for instance, this is a bit of buffalo horn. When you were a cutler and you're wanting to sell knives to the population and your cutlery looked the same as everybody else's, how did you differentiate? You know, you might have had ivory handles, you might have had bone handles, you might have had tortoiseshell handles, you might have had stone handles, you might have had buffalo handles. So there's quite a range, but that was one of the ways of differentiating. I met a guy yesterday who worked for a factory making garden tools, and he was talking about how good the garden tools were that he'd been involved in making 20 years ago. And they were involved in a sort of casting process. I'm sure some of you might have had that experience. You've been and bought a cheap garden tool recently and you put it in the ground and try and bend something and this, you know, the tool is bent. So there's a difference between the solidity of things that were made in the past and things that were made now. Some of the things we've got in the collection are the biggest collection in the world that we know of. So we've probably got the biggest collection of saws in the world. Okay. Slightly inconveniently, they're organized like on library shelves. And so they're not the best, easiest things to see, but we have a cunning plan to make them digital, to make a digital gallery of the best 200 and put that on the internet. But we will have components. And again, it's a bit of a challenge. How many components should we keep? Or should we give the component pocket knives items to Steve Cocker and say, Steve, can you use these to actually make some proper knives? But yeah, or complete knives. So it's not just physical objects. We don't know how many objects we've got in the collection. When I started 11 years ago, we catalogued 33,000 items. We have passed the milestone of cataloguing 50,000 items. We think we have in excess of 100,000 items, but give or take 20,000, 30,000 either way. Okay. We sometimes have boxes with a number on, so the box has been catalogued, but the individual items haven't. But we also we've got trade catalogues. There's a cutlery catalogue and there's a couple of James Neal's bits on the back. Often if you find an object and you don't know what it is, you can go to a trade catalogue and you can find out what happened. And the trade catalogues are staggering items. We have one by a company called Warden Payne that's got 450 pages. The cutlery catalogues have got 250 pages in them. And every page has got 20 or 30 items. Every page is individually typeset. We've got thousands of printing blocks actually as well from some of the catalogues. And it's a bit of a challenge. What should we do with them? But we have some very modern catalogues. So recently I did a talk about James Neal, and they were operating until 2010. And actually they had a very fiery takeover of Spear & Jackson. And Spear & Jackson didn't like that. But in the end, the company was branded as Spear & Jackson. So in the next talk, I'm going to Jackson. But so when I want to do a talk on a company, I can go to the catalogues. I can go to a ephemera, which might just be newspaper cuttings that were collected over a period of time from things like the Star of the Morning Telegraph, which doesn't exist anymore. And I can also go to firms' histories. So again, it's an interesting challenge, I think, in the city. If anybody wants to research a firm's history, how do you pull all those things together? But I generally do find we've got resources in Hawley to put those stories together without you having to resort to, say, going to the archives. Okay. One of the lessons we've learned over the last few years is the power of digital. And also it's interesting, this collection and Sheffield from all over the world. One of the things Ken did with his cine cameras and early video cameras, he went out there and he filmed some of the last people that would do some of his jobs and trades. He captured those things. And that was a fantastic thing. He often tells who the people were in the film, which was rather inconvenient, but it did show the process. And so a combination of us actually having those films put into a modern format, and also that notion of people giving us films, us taking new films, any talk we do. So we put these now on a YouTube channel, and our YouTube channel's had 1.5 million hits. It's slightly distorted by the fact that one of those is 440,000 people have looked at the video, kept on making the file. You know, and it's interesting that file making, which in some ways wasn't the most glamorous industry in Sheffield, because we think about shine stuff, but file making, it was essential to, you know, industry throughout the country, throughout the world, and there's an awful lot of interest in it worldwide. But we do get real peaks on there, and every talk we do now, we put on that channel, and it's growing. And actually, another lesson is, if you can build your YouTube channel big enough, you start to earn some money. So we're now, you know, you have to put adverts, you have to decide how many adverts are coming in, but there's a balance between having a couple of adverts in each film and getting a bit of money in from YouTube. You know, there's some of the more recent ones we've done, and we've got 6 or 7 films in the pipeline that we need to put up.
Yeah, so these are some of the, Billy Hewkin, he was a famous razor, one of the last people who could make a cutthroat razor. So we've got films on all these people, basically, and most of these people are sadly now deceased, but their families, still exist in the city. Some of these are still famous Sheffield surnames. So, all these are available online to look on the YouTube channel. You don't have to come here to do it. Yeah. We've also got lots of photographs. Yes, that was another thing that we can pull in. And we're adding to that photograph. So essentially, we've now made the biggest photographic archive of table knives in the world. Okay. When I came, my first job was to sort out a box of knives. And I said, what we did with these? It's a bit like, I don't know what we did with these. How were we got them? We didn't know. All we had was boxes beginning with A, B, C, D, none of which had been catalogued. So I organised those into alphabetical order, started checking what we'd got, and I had the idea that we could use knives to get people excited about the museum. And the thing was, seeing their name on a knife blade. I thought about creating a physical knife wall, which would have been difficult to read, but when you go to a war memorial, the first thing you do is look for your name. But in the end, somehow the masterstroke appeared and we made it digital. That gets 250 hits every day now, the name on the knife blade. And it's become the #1 research tool for people looking at their names on the knife blade. But we're hoping in the sort of next development maybe to have that database completely searchable. Massive thanks to Jeffrey Tweedale who gave us all his data. But we now find companies that are not on Tweedale. We find knives that are not on the database, so we're constantly adding to it. But it's really exciting. There's 2 touchscreens in the gallery. When somebody finds their name on it, and even better when they say, that's a picture of my granddad. That's what makes it worthwhile. But I think the thing is, if you take a 5-year-old in there, they can see the name. Get them interested in the old stuff, yeah? Yeah, so just example of a photograph we've got with some of the famous companies. Yeah, so we have got a library as well. And again, if people, if there were people here or your organisations wanted to do some research, it's relatively accessible. Okay. And some of those are things Ken's collected, some of the things we're adding to, some of the regular publications we've added to it ourselves. I suppose one of the things you find with a lot of historical books is they've got very limited editions in the runs. So actually, you'll get a point where you can't get them anymore, you can't even buy them. If you want to buy Jeff Tweedale's knife book, it's a lot of money, it might be 150 quid. And yeah, we've got a copy upstairs, you could just come in and have a look at it. Yeah, another thing we've got original drawings, artwork, and technical drawings. At some point, Ken interacted, I'm using my words carefully here, with the drawings of Baffin and Webb. I don't know if they were in a skip, I don't know if he was offered them, I don't know if he went in with his double big coat on, but anyway, so we've got the original, quite a lot of original drawings from Baffin and Webb. And one of the things there, we've got the original drawings of the Lonsdale belts. Now, what I don't know is, I don't know if several Sheffield companies made Lonsdale belts or designed them, or whether just Baffin and Webb designed them. Okay, but we've got the original drawings. A few years ago, some of the volunteers had a bit of communication with Baffin and Webb asking about where some of these things were. Baffin and Webb said, we want our drawings back. At which we said no. They did offer to scan them, which they never got around to doing actually. But again, there's an interesting notion about some of the things we've acquired. And we do sometimes now get offered archives from some Sheffield companies if they still exist and they haven't been thrown out. Obviously, the problem with a lot of physical archives is they're very bulky. But yeah. Yes, we have some publications. This is the sort of the publication. Interesting. Some of the things in that publication we don't know where they are, but there's still stuff in Ken's house. So we still have to clear Ken's house actually, despite the fact he died 10 years ago. Partly was because his wife died much later, and she had Alzheimer's. They didn't want to disturb it. But anyway, that's another challenge for us. But we've got probably the only books on British soils were done by one of our volunteers, Simon. Yeah. Sometimes you go in a box, there's a handwritten note from Ken. There's lots of handwritten notes from Ken. Half the books in our library, Ken's gone through and Ken's corrected them. I don't know the author's got that, but again, it's just sums up the depth what we've actually got. And it is still, it's still the case. You hear the story about people who've gone into a museum, opened a box, and nobody's been in it for 10 years. Well, certainly here you could do, that might happen. Yeah. Two positions. Generally we don't buy things. Okay, we get given lots of stuff. The thing on the left, sorry, on the right here, that's the royal sword. So that was presented to Queen Victoria's daughter, Victoria Adelaide. You can imagine when she got married, imagine how excited she was when she got a sword in a Sheffield manufacturer. However, the company that made the sword were tailors who were based at the Adelaide Works. So maybe a company in the Adelaide Works giving a sword to Princess Adelaide was quite a smart marketing venture. The other thing was Princess Victoria Adelaide married the guy who became the Kaiser. So she went to live in Germany. And I understand in Germany there's a bit of tradition cooking a wedding cake with a sword. So this treasure ended up in Germany in some castle. And the Americans arrived in 1945, German castle, and told the occupants they've got 10 minutes to get out and could take what they carried. They didn't take the sword. The sword turned up in Paris in 1960, bought by a tool collector. I think when he died, his estate was sold. So essentially, it came up on the market, I think about 2017, 2018, and we bought it. We had a slight problem buying it because it's being looted by the Americans. We had, I think, the Arts Council gave us around £5,000, but they said, well, how can you prove the provenance of this sword? So we had to get in touch with the German royal family. The person we got in touch with is one of the very few people who went to Prince Philip's funeral. There weren't many people at Prince Philip's funeral. Basically said you could have it. So that's one of our things. On the right, I would argue, and I'm biased, sorry, Steve, just go back. On the right, I would argue this is the greatest treasure in Sheffield that's publicly available for people to see. It's out there now. It's the Joseph Rogers year knife made in 1822 with 2,000 blades. Well, give or take 30 in either direction, because if you ever try and count them, I think you get lost in it. The idea was there was a blade put on for every year of the Christian calendar, last blade put on year 2000 by Stan Shaw. And in reality, towards the end, blades put on blocks to mark famous events like us winning the World Cup or a royal wedding. It was Sheffield just showing off, this is how good we are. This is what we can make. It's got a royal crest at the top. I did attempt a few years ago to reunite this knife with the other Joseph Rogers knife, which is in the Cutler's Hall, which is equally splendid, but obviously not very accessible. And that's only got 57 blades. Spent 6 months negotiating to borrow it, had it all lined up, and those told I couldn't have it. I moved that knife and some other really nice knives into the foyer at Kelham, and sadly at 3 o'clock in the morning, somebody broke in trying to steal the ear knife. They didn't get it, and it's just sad that thought that a private collector wanted to steal the ear knife, because a lot of Sheffield's greatest treasures are in the house of private collectors. The ear knife was for sale in the 1990s, and the council and the museum couldn't afford to buy it. So Stanley Tools bought it, and it used to be in the foyer at Rutland Road. They used to take it out on the road and they do exhibitions. I think Ken turned up one day with 12 on his big coat and said, "Can I have it?" And actually, so we got it on Royal Perfect Road. Only 200th birthday, we got in touch with Stanley Tools. They didn't realise they owned it. So actually, they'd let us have it. So it's ours now. So that's preserved and safe for the city. So I think, again, it's just a good opportunity. Yes, Steve. Something else that's been happening recently is that people have been offering us collections. If any collector ever contacts us now, I'm really quite keen to build a relationship with them. And, you know, I'm a collector, sorts. And you get to a point in your life where your kids don't want what's collected, and you think, what am I going to do with it? And yes, you can sell it, in which case it gets broken up. This was a chap that was a friend of Ken's. Ken looked after him. He was a bit recluse, Dennis Smith. He died with no money at all. So the council took his possessions. Now, fortunately, a guy called Michael Dyson, some of you might know, can be quite eccentric, but Michael tipped us off about this. We managed to get this collection. And as a result, quite a lot of this collection is on display, and actually on the table at the back is some things from that collection that we haven't catalogued yet. Okay, but it's just that notion of acquiring a collection is really quite powerful. And again, there's people all over the world that collected Sheffield things. If we can get them back and bring them back to the city, yeah. Thing called Tool Bank. If you go to the main gallery, essentially they had a boardroom full of absolutely fabulous tools. It's in Kent, and they got to a point of thinking, we want the room back. And anyway, they offered it us. We got, I don't know, there's 20, 30, 40 crates of tools in fabulous condition that have come here that we rotate on a rotating basis. Yeah. Roy Ribsdale, Sheffield artist, came and used the collection. So again, that's something else. It's not something that's done very often, but again, we have things that are beautiful. We have things that are, you know, just good reflecting art. Yeah. So I mentioned the name of the Knife Blade Project. You can do it in the gallery, but you can do it on a mobile phone. And there's some cards at the back. You can pick it, and that's just a great thing to do. See if your family name. So that was one of our £40,000 projects. The Sheffield Treasures project. On the right, that's a Jason Heppenstall sculpture. If you pay Jason Heppenstall £7,000, that's what you get. We didn't know what we were getting. We commissioned it. You know, and I think this is something maybe, whereas heritage organisations, we're a bit naive, or, you know, we bid for something, we have a sum of money, but we don't know what we're going to get for it. But actually, Jason exceeded himself. I thought we were going to get something very temporary, and we got something very permanent. And he did work with some school students at the University Technical College, so that worked really well. So I say digital's really taken off, and we're going to do a lot more of that. That's just some contact details for the Hawley Collection. What else has got? Is there anything else on this? That's the end. Yeah, so we have this one a big lottery bid. Well, £230,000. We're employing a full-time member of staff. We're working with 6 existing heritage companies. One is to get the message out there that Sheffield still makes them. Okay, and some of the heritage companies are actually doing quite well. They're innovating. They're bringing in new machinery. They've stopped stealing workers from each other, and they've realised it's good to collaborate with each other. So we're going to essentially go in with a film crew and some school students into those 6 companies. We'll film what's going on. We'll get them on the YouTube channel. We've even got them booked in for a stall at the Kelham Christmas market. So they're going to have their items for sale. They're not the cheapest items, but they are good quality and they're made in Sheffield. So thanks very much. Quick run through that. If at the end you want to back up the tour of Hawley, happy to do that, or you might just want to linger in the gallery. Happy to answer any questions. Thanks.